Okay, so I promise this will be the last of my depressing reads. I'm going to pick something cheerful next. But Schopenhauer, in his writings, always comes back to empathy, which helps me connect to him more. But overarchingly, if I had to summarize his worldview, it would be very much in alignment with what Buddhism has to say about the suffering of the world and in life, that suffering itself gives meaning to life. Life is suffering, and the way to overcome that is through compassion. That is his main core tenet. With that brief introduction, I'll very quickly mention one other thing, which is that the approach he takes to things happening around him is always through a comparative lens. How he looks at, he doesn't forget where he comes from, and also how bad other people have it, which makes his own position better or even satisfactory to live with. But be that as it may, as an example to show how this comparative analysis works, he takes the example of man versus an animal or a brute, let's say. He compares how each of these creatures deal with pain and deal with pleasure. And that's another comparison of pain versus pleasure. He again posits that if you put together all the suffering in the world and if you put together all the pleasures in this world, you will find that the sum of all the sufferings or pain is much, much greater than what little pleasure we get after overcoming that pain. So, again, his hypothesis is that life in general and the universe, let's say, is way more suffering, and that is the essence of it. So, that has to give it meaning. Another example is he compares in terms of religion, Old Testament versus the New Testament. That is one. Again, that's the most popular, but he compares how different religions look at suffering vis-a-vis Buddhism and Brahmanism. And very interesting. We'll get into it in depth later in this review, but I just like that he takes this approach of always remembering that different people have different viewpoints, and to be able to live with yourself and with the suffering of the world, the way to transcend that is to understand where other people are coming from, and that's it. You only need compassion to get through life. This is in stark contrast, and again we'll go into depth with this later, but with how other philosophers dealt with it. For example, if I remember, Nietzsche says that the way to deal with pain is through art, for example. You can use art to express yourself and build self-confidence, and in that manner overcome your suffering. So that is one way how Nietzsche dealt with it. And again, the will to power, as he calls it, has always been the focal point of his arguments. But the insight that Schopenhauer has is that, and again, a very basic insight, that desires, or our will as is called, is the source of that suffering. When we will something, what we are faced with is frustration or a craving for something that doesn't exist. And when we fulfill that particular will, are we satisfied? No. What we are is we want something else. We get a very brief moment of temporary pleasure, after which our heart again desires more or wants more. And hence the conclusion that desire is the source of all suffering. Very much what Buddhism says, that all life is suffering. So anyway, so very interesting how different people have dealt with this question, but keeping our focus to this text itself, let's see what we can learn more. He starts off the essay with a jibe at Leibniz, I think, and wrongfully that, as the translator's note says, but just that the argument that pleasure is just the absence of pain is false. There are some things that are inherently evil or bad, and there are some things that are inherently good. It's not a Boolean true and false thing, and it's not just something that we humans have assigned value to. We cannot just change our wiring or our thought process and make something that is evil or painful. We cannot make it good. He then moves to his point that, so this is about boredom, right? So what happens when we have desire, as I explained very briefly, is that satisfaction that we get after achieving that particular desire is very brief, and we are constantly in this state of uh, boredom or frustration, or the heart constantly wants better things or more things, is what he says. But and again, in consequence of this, the argument follows that inherently life will contain more pain than pleasure, and even us waiting for something good to happen only causes us pain, because we have this image of something in front of us that we desire, and after we get that, we are only met with disappointment, because it can never get to the point where it is as good as we had imagined it. So we are only left with disappointment. And a good analogy, just to put into words this abstract uh, concept, is that he gives the example of children. Did children sign up for this life? They did not. Do they know that life as time passes on is only going to get worse, tougher, more responsibilities? They don't know that. And yet they have this innocent charm and enthusiasm of life inside them. So he says that this isn't fair on them. It's like the children waiting for a theater or a play or a movie, something like that. Then they're very excited for it. But once the curtain uh, drops or opens, they are met with the harsh realities of life. So we essentially should not be hopeful for anything, because you are going to be met with disappointment in the end. And again, this is where the pessimism comes in, and that's what this guy is mainly known for. Okay. Again, one quick point that I wanted to add to this itself is that we understood how desire is the source of suffering, right? Where does that desire come from? Again, he drives deeper and he breaks it down into much baser instincts of survival instinct. That is what is driving us, not some hormone secreted by our body, but just the will to survive that keeps us alive. That is the root cause of suffering. Then he goes on to take some examples from religion, which I liked again. He says how Christianity is a bit different from other religions, where, again, if you have read the Old Testament, you will know that the chapters on creation, is the way it is defined is that God, or Jesus in more particular ways, made this and he saw this to be good, right? He made the plants and he saw that it is good, or he made animals and he realized it to be good, as if that is the main point of the thing. And he disagrees with this vehemently, because there is nothing inherently good about them. He compares this to Brahmanism, or in some cases Buddhism, where the creation of this world is described as an accident in the case of Buddha, and in the case of Brahma, it's almost that he is to serve punishment for creating all of this suffering in the form of our earth on this universe, and Brahma is among us humans serving for the crime that he committed of creation. So it's very interesting how different religions also deal with the creation, and how it ties into our survival instinct of, again, reproduction and continuing this species. And again, nothing can be more obvious than the sin that the Adam and Eve story talks about, where eating the apple is said to be the sin, but as a result, we can make the argument that whole life that flowed out of Eve after that sin is the punishment that is dealt to Eve for committing that sin. And here we again have that contradiction of, if everything is good, if God saw this to be good, then in this story of Adam and Eve, we have sin committed and creation being a consequence of the punishment for that sin. So very interesting. Again, I found it extremely insightful. There are again some points, finer points, where he compares the New Testament to the Old that I couldn't connect a lot with because I'm not Christian, but maybe you'll find meaning in those. Okay, just to cap all of this off, do we have, yeah, the solutions. So the way he again also prescribes this towards the end, that now that we have recognized that all the world is suffering and even hopes and desires are the cause of that suffering, now that we realize that, how do you deal with it? You again go back to some basic tenets of Christianity. Again, I don't want to mention this, but somehow him harking on religious texts, I didn't find it very enjoyable. But anyway, if the arguments are sound and if the conclusions he comes from it are plausible and it makes sense to me, then why not take it? But he goes back to love thy neighbor, for example. And again, his core way of dealing with suffering is that we have to show empathy and compassion to our fellow humans. They are doing things because they are a product of their environment, and there is no other way to look at it. If you deal hate out in response to hate, you are only perpetuating that machine. Hate begets hate, as MLK said. But okay, I completely understand and agree with this point that the only way to look at people you don't like is with empathy, and you can learn something from them too. And that's a very powerful message that I took away from this text. I'm sorry if I missed some finer points in this essay. It's not too difficult to get through, but again, a depressing read nonetheless, and I didn't agree with some of them. Interesting. Let's just end it at that. Thank you for listening.